The roar of an explosion, hotter than molten iron, tears through your eardrums as human limbs scatter into the air before a single scream can be uttered. In the 13th century, wherever the Mongol legions of the Yuan dynasty stepped, lightning fell from the heavens, and the ground turned into a sea of fire. People of that time believed this was the wrath of God, or the trickery of demons. But it wasn't supernatural. It was the emergence of a lethal powder that would forever change the history of human slaughter: black powder. Imagine this. You are holding your ground atop a fortress wall when a never-before-seen iron sphere flies through the air, piercing clean through the torso of the comrade standing next to you. Steam rises from the gaping hole in his chest. How would you feel? Today's story is a brutal and vivid record of how the forbidden weapon called gunpowder turned battlefields into a living hell of blood and flame, far beyond simple territorial expansion. The weapon used by the Yuan army, known as the Thunder Crash Bomb, Lei, was quite literally a thunderbolt that shook the heavens. It was an iron casing packed with gunpowder and ignited by a fuse. The moment it detonated, every living thing within dozens of meters was crushed beyond recognition. Records state that the iron casing shattered into shrapnel that tore through human flesh, like paper, and ground bones into dust. Armor was useless. The explosive pressure bypassed thick leather and iron plates to rupture internal organs instantly. Have you ever imagined the horror of dying not by a blade, but by an invisible wave of air that makes you vomit blood as your insides collapse? The cruelty of gunpowder began long before it reached the battlefield. To mass-produce this dust of death, the Yuan dynasty operated massive human factories. Tens of thousands of captives and slaves were trapped in underground caves and damp warehouses to mix the powder. The fine dust of sulfur and saltpeter slowly rotted the lungs of the workers. They coughed up blood daily, and their eyes festered and went blind from the toxic fumes. To the Mongol commanders, these people were not human. They were mere consumables used to generate firepower. If a single spark flew due to a wrong mixing ratio, the entire factory became a massive tomb. Imagine the life of a slave who had to wipe away the remains of a disintegrated comrade before being forced to mix the next batch. Could you have endured even a single day in such a hellish factory? The gunpowder warfare of the Yuan was not limited to throwing bombs. They deployed the fire lance, the ancestor of all firearms. It was a tube of bamboo or iron, filled with gunpowder, arrows, or jagged shards of iron. The gout of flame erupting from this weapon turned the front lines into charcoal in seconds. Visualize a charging cavalryman engulfed in a massive pillar of fire, burning alive, along with his horse. The stench of searing human flesh and the screams of burning animals filled the air, leaving survivors to kneel and wail for their gods. Would you have the courage to charge through this wall of fire? Or would you turn and run, only to feel a scorching shard of iron bury itself in your back? Chilling records suggest that the Mongols used captives as human test subjects to calibrate the power of their weapons. They would line prisoners up in a row to see how many bodies a single fire lance could penetrate, or observe how thunder crash shrapnel pulverized a human skull. When the hot blood of a perforated prisoner splashed onto the face of the man standing behind him, the terror was beyond comprehension. This was not mere execution. It was a demonic experiment in the dehumanization of war. If you were at the end of that line, watching the people in front of you explode one by one, what would be going through your mind? The Yuan also maximized gunpowder for psychological warfare. During sieges, they used special smoke bombs mixed with arsenic. The moment the citizens inside the walls inhaled the smoke, they felt their throats and lungs burning, spitting up blood in a frantic struggle for air. It was a slow suffocation, a lingering death. Outside the walls, the Mongol army listened to the chorus of agonizing groans as they prepared the next volley. This wasn't a war, it was a one-sided slaughter fueled by chemical fire. We often believe the Mongols conquered the world solely through horsemanship. In reality, the firepower units comprised of conscripted Chinese engineers, were the primary architects of their victory. As the Mongol cavalry surged like a storm, the artillery units behind them spat the fires of hell to turn fortress gates into splinters. Eventually, this technology traveled through the Middle East to Europe. Ironically, Eastern gunpowder would later dismantle the knightly class of the West and open the Age of Discovery. The conquerors we praise as heroes were, in fact, the greatest destroyers in history, teaching humanity the most efficient way to kill. At the height of the conflict, the Yuan army used a weapon called the 10,000 Man. Enemy, one rend the large fire globes. These were massive balls made of dried grass and gunpowder, ignited and rolled down hills. Anything in their path was reduced to ash. One record describes soldiers jumping into a nearby river to escape the flames, only to find that the oil-based gunpowder kept burning even under the water. They were burned alive while submerged. If you saw a comrade drowning while engulfed in flames beneath the waves, would you still believe in the glory of war? The situation grew even more bizarre when the Yuan crossed the sea to Japan. The Japanese samurai stood on the shoreline of Hakata Bay, expecting a traditional one-on-one duel. A samurai stepped forward, shouting his lineage and name, demanding a fair fight. But the response was not a polite greeting. Thunder crash bombs launched from ships exploded in mid-air, raining iron and ceramic shards onto the warriors. The horses, driven mad by the explosions and the smell of sulfur, threw their masters into the mud. Beneath the fallen helmets, the heat of the gunpowder seared into their faces. The most horrific episode of this naval war was the Burning Sea. The Yuan forces threw jars of oil mixed with gunpowder into the water, turning the entire bay into a furnace. Samurai who jumped from sinking ships found themselves trapped not in cold waves but in boiling oil fire, weighted down by their armor. They couldn't sink but were roasted alive on the surface. The smell of cooking flesh drifted all the way to the shore. To survive, men pushed their comrades underwater to use them as stepping stones. If you were in the middle of that sea, clutching the throat of the person next to you while the flames closed in, would concepts like Bushido or loyalty still exist? Or would only the ugliest human instincts remain? The story doesn't end there. In the deserts of the Middle East, the Yuan fire units faced the elite Mamluk cavalry. In the blistering desert heat, gunpowder was even more lethal. The Mongols mounted cannons on the backs of camels to maintain mobility. When the Mamluks charged, the Mongols used smoke screens to blind them and detonated powder beneath their feet. Amidst the sandstorms and black smoke, horses engulfed in flames trampled their own riders. The desert sand turned black, with a mixture of blood and soot, littered with charred human remains. Ultimately, the Yuan gunpowder wars were not just about expanding territory. They were a violent pivot that dragged the history of warfare from the realm of honor and morality into the realm of firepower and destruction. Walls had to become thicker, armor became meaningless, and war transformed from a duel of heroes into a competition of who possessed more powder. This is the reality of the great empire we admire and the face of history we often choose to ignore. So I ask you, was the Yuan Gunpowder War a catalyst for human civilization or a curse that maximized the efficiency of murder? Was the spark of their cannons a beacon of progress or the key to the gates of hell? Knowing that modern civilization is built upon such a history of fire and blood, how do you receive this truth? The Yuan gunpowder left no grass growing in its wake, but its flame still burns within human history. If this story chilled you to the bone, share your thoughts in the comments. Was gunpowder a blessing or a devil's powder that humanity should never have touched? Could you have marched forward even a single step amidst that overwhelming roar? Next time, we will trace how this gunpowder technology crossed into Europe and began severing the necks of medieval knights in their castles. Your engagement is the spark that lights up this dark history. Until next time.